Well, thank you all for being here. My name is Tony Kay. I'm the Vice President for Scholarly Programs here at the National Humanities Center, and it is my pleasure to welcome our speaker for this evening, Marlene Daut. Marlene is Associate Professor of African Diaspora Studies at the Carter G. Woodson Institute of African American and African American Studies and the Program in American Studies at the University of Virginia. She was previously Associate Professor of English and Cultural Studies and Director of Africana Studies at Claremont Graduate University. Professor Daut received her PhD in English from the University of Notre Dame in 2009, and since that time, her groundbreaking work has already transformed our understanding of the literary and cultural significance of the Haitian Revolution in the Atlantic world. When her first book, Tropics of Haiti, Race and the Literary History of the Haitian Revolution in the Atlantic World, appeared last summer, it was widely praised for its impressive scope and meticulous research. It will soon be followed by her second book, Baron de Vasti and the Origins of Black Atlantic Humanism, the first single-authored, book-length exploration of this important Haitian writer and political figure. This year, she is the Josephus Daniels Fellow at the Center, and she is working on an ambitious anthology of literary texts dealing with the Haitian Revolution. This unprecedented collection of texts written in the aftermath of the Haitian Revolution promises to shed new light on the ways that the revolution was received, portrayed, and reinterpreted in the Caribbean. The revolution was received, portrayed, and reinterpreted in the Caribbean, the United States, Europe, and across the Atlantic world. So please join me in welcoming Marlene Daut as she speaks with us tonight about the Haitian Atlantic.
Good evening. Thank you all for coming out here this evening. Before I begin, I would like to take this opportunity to thank the Research Triangle Foundation of North Carolina for the Josephus Daniels Fellowship that has made my time here possible. And I'd also like to thank the staff and administrators of this Humanities Center. And last but certainly not least, I'd like to thank the current fellows for enriching and lively conversations every day at lunch and beyond. So we've all had an interesting week, and I thought I should just mention the elephant in the room. So I questioned at first whether I should give a talk about the triumphant legacy of the Haitian Revolution in light of recent events in Haiti and recent events here at home. I thought I could sit here and I could give you more despair, maybe. And there is certainly much about which to despair concerning Haiti's current reality and about our own. God knows I could tell you tales about the Haitian Revolution that could bring us all to tears. But I ultimately decided that what we do need to know is that another world was and is possible, that in the past people did imagine other more pleasant realities for Haiti, for themselves, for us, and ultimately for the world. And so maybe the hopeful engagement of 19th-century Atlantic world writers with the history and legacy of the Haitian Revolution can remind us all that the revolution is not over. It never will be. It's a lifelong struggle for human rights, and we can't ever fall asleep at the wheel. These 19th century writers knew that, and so we are tasked with never forgetting. The African-American writer James Theodore Hawley, who emigrated to Haiti in the 1860s, once said, "The Haitian Revolution is also the grandest political event of this or any other age." I still believe that to be true. In fact, I believe it now more than ever before. So, a brief little prologue about this presentation that you are viewing up here on the screens. I'd really just kind of like to explain a little bit what's going on there in the visuals. This is a story map of the larger project from which this presentation is derived. It's designed to be a supplement, soon to be standalone, and it is a work in progress. It contains images, quotations, historical timelines, links to full text, and a few links to historical maps. I'm not going to be reading everything that is up there on the slides, and I don't expect you to either. I know the print is small. For the purposes of this presentation, I'm more interested actually in having you see the map that is on the left-hand side as I trace the physical and imaginative journey of the Haitian Revolution across the Atlantic world in the 19th century. I'm very interested in visualizing how people encountered the Haitian Revolution in different spaces, how they imagined it in different spaces, where they imagined it to be. But if you are interested in perusing this story map further, particularly the text on the right-hand side, you can visit the website listed there at the bottom, and you just scroll to the bottom of the page and click on the link that says the Haitian Atlantic. So now an anecdote to begin about the term the Haitian Atlantic. Many moons ago, my dissertation director, Glenn Hendler, called my exams in US literature to 1930, that was one, 19th and 20th century Haitian literature, that was exam number 2, and French colonial literature, exam number 3, my little Haitian Atlantic. That was nearly 15 years ago. So it's taken me this long, a kind of circuitous journey, to come back to these texts and try to figure out what this corpus could mean gathered together and analyzed together. I questioned what the writers on each of my lists might have to say to one another. I wanted to know if there were circuits that connected them. I've identified 3 circuits that connect them today. Print circulation is circuit 1, how their works were received in various locations and made to perform different functions. So the authors may have written the text in a certain time period, in a certain context, but long after the texts were written, they were attached to different places, different ideas, including the Haitian Revolution. The second circuit is travel. People and their actual movements, how they connected themselves to one another by moving themselves from place to place. The third circuit is intertextuality, the languages embedded in the writing, particular shared vocabularies that became attached to the Haitian Revolution, Haitian independence, and ultimately to the abolition of slavery in the Atlantic world. And so in this talk, I'm really going to be talking about how these 3 elements work together to produce a geographical formation in the 19th century Atlantic world that really centered to a great extent the story of Haitian independence. And it did so with activist aims to argue for the end of slavery principally, and to bolster Haitian sovereignty. So then the Haitian Atlantic, as an organizing principle, can be thought of as a conception of the world in which Haiti, its history, its geography, its literature, and its culture appears at the center and not at the margins. One of the reasons I like the concept of the Haitian Atlantic is that I think it can push us really far to take seriously the point of view of Haitian writers who understandably centered their own experiences of not only the revolution, but its aftermath, Haitian independence in a slaveholding world. This sense of grounding their understanding of the world in the origin story of Haiti is reflected in the quotes by these 3 Haitian writers that I'd like to read to you. So the first quote comes from the early 19th century Haitian historian Beaubrun-Ardouin. In 1832, he wrote a book entitled Géographie de l'île d'Haïti. It's actually a pretty short history of Haiti's revolution and political events up until the time he was publishing, and it became a kind of a standard textbook that was used in Haitian schools throughout the 19th century. One of the things that really interested me about the work is that it's a history book, but it's called a géographie. And so part of the inspiration for thinking about this corpus as a literary geography. So he wrote, "So we might say that out of all the islands of the Caribbean, Haiti is the most advantageously situated with respect to the links that it can make with these islands and with Colombia. Those that it can maintain with Europe and the United States do not render less advantageous this geographical position." I'm really interested in the way that he focuses on Haiti's position in the Caribbean and in the Atlantic. Demesvar Delorme is the second author. In 1873, he wrote a work entitled La misère au sein des richesses. He said, "And who knows, when prosperous and capable of providing the economic means that comprise the power of other countries, what humanitarian destinies Providence will lead us toward in this archipelago of the Caribbean, of which we are at the center." So he connected Haiti's physical location to a humanitarian destiny, a providential one, in his words. The third author is Louis-Joseph Janvier. His book, La République d'Haïti et ses visiteurs, was published in 1883. He wrote, "It is the independence of Haiti that led to the emancipation of the slaves in the British colonies, to the foundation of Liberia, and the emancipation of the slaves in Martinique, and later in the United States. It was the independence and sovereignty of Haiti that put an advantageous pressure on various governments, and then led to the emancipation of slaves in Puerto Rico and Brazil." So Janvier here really focusing not on a future destiny, but on what he figured to be an actual reality, Haiti's revolution having grand repercussions for the hemisphere. So I'm asking us to take seriously the engagement of 19th century Atlantic world writers who shared this vision of the world, one that did not just include Haiti and Haitian writers, historians, and politicians, but one that was really focused on Haiti as a political destiny, even if only metaphorically. Reflected in the title of this talk, then, is the idea that we are moving Haiti out of the margins in order to ask, what does the geography of the Atlantic, its geopolitics, intellectual, and cultural histories look like when Haiti appears not in political, historical, cultural, and literary outer space, but at the center of the development of modern democracy and its intellectual history? So Haitians are not merely actors in this revolution, they are also people who theorized it and historicized it afterward. This talk is about a place, Haiti, and places in the broader Atlantic world associated with the Haitian Revolution, but it is also about a language and a vocabulary drawn from the Haitian Revolution that becomes repeated and repurposed by Atlantic world writers in the 19th century to imagine a future where slavery was ended, where colonialism could be checked, and where freedom could reign. In his 1967 interview with the Haitian writer René Depestre, the Martinican poet Aimé Césaire referred to the Negro Renaissance movement in the United States, La Revue Indigène in Haiti, and Negrismo in Cuba as parallel movements vis-à-vis a global or diasporic Black experience. Césaire went on to say that at this time in the history of the world, meaning the early 20th century, there was a coming to consciousness among Negroes that had manifested itself in movements that had no relationship to each other. What Césaire called the clear coming to consciousness that all of these movements helped to coalesce separately in his mind for people of African descent around the world has been referred to in 20th century American studies variously as the Black Atlantic, Pan-Africanism, and Black internationalism. These terms attempt to describe and account for the intellectual articulation of the African diaspora as an international, comparative, and multilingual movement for civil rights, one that conceptually and formally links writers as diverse as Booker T. Washington, Frantz Fanon, Jean-Price Mars, W.E.B. Du Bois, René Marin, Senghor, and Zora Neale Hurston. Brent Hayes Edwards has pushed many of these largely conceptual connections much further. He suggests that one approach to the stirrings of the cultures of Black internationalism is to consider the ways that during and after the war, metropolitan France was one of the key places where African Americans, Antillians, and Africans were able to, quote unquote, link up. In the practice of diaspora, Edwards argues that 370,000 African Americans who served in the segregated American Expeditionary Force in France and the nearly 620,000 soldiers from French colonies in Senegal and the Sudan, along with hundreds of African-American visitors and expatriates, helped post-war Paris to become, quote, a vibrant cosmopolitan space for interaction that was available neither in the United States nor in the colonies, end quote. Edwards writes, Paris is crucial because it allowed boundary crossing, conversations, and collaborations that were available nowhere else to the same degree. Yet the connections, both formal and imagined, between an Anglophone Black intellectual community and a Francophone Black intellectual community far predates the post-World War I period of the Harlem Renaissance and the international journals and movements with which it came to be associated. In From Harlem to Paris, Michel Fabre suggested that in the early decades of the 19th century, when transatlantic travel was reserved for a happy few, the major link between Afro-Americans and France was to be found in New Orleans. Throughout the 19th century, though, textual references to the Haitian Revolution and Haitian independence, as well as the travels to Haiti of many American writers of African descent, intimately connected emergent African-American literature to a Francophone literary community in Port-au-Prince. If New Orleans, London, and Paris had become three of the geographical locales that could link Anglophone and Francophone practices of diaspora, Haiti undoubtedly served as yet another of these crucial intellectual and aesthetic sites of Black international solidarity, or to use Francis Smith Foster's term, creative collaboration. These links include the anonymously published Teresa, a Haitian Tale, a serialized short story which appeared in 1828 in the first African-American newspaper, Freedom's Journal. Freedom's Journal also published several excerpts of an English translation of the 19th century Haitian writer Baron de Vatté's Reflections on the Blacks and Whites, a work which is probably the first example of what we now call critical race theory. Across the Atlantic, the Louisiana-born Francophone author Victor Séjour published what is considered by many to be the first African-American short story, Le Mulâtre. This story describes a fictional representation of a slave revolt in colonial Saint-Domingue. Importantly, Séjour's tale was published in the Martinican abolitionist Cyril Bisset's Parisian journal, La Revue des Colonies. This journal was the first French serial directed by and produced for people of color. Notably, also in 1837, the Revue, whose stated aim was to group together and give the greatest publicity to the problems and injustices faced by persons of color, reprinted a short biographical sketch and 3 poems written by Phillis Wheatley. The 3 poems were on the death of J.C. an infant, An Hymn to the Morning, and to the Right Honorable William, Earl of Dartmouth. But Wheatley's poems had actually already been printed, along with the aforementioned biography, in the famous French abolitionist priest, the Abbé Grégoire's De la littérature des nègres in 1808. This work soon became a standard source for transatlantic abolitionists. And this work would travel far and beyond Paris, where it was published. It would fall into the hands of a Haitian writer, Juste Chanlat, who would actually attach Grégoire's name to his History of Haiti, which was published in 1810, making it one of the first histories of Haiti. So Chanlat's work was entitled Le Cri de la Nature ou Hommage haïtien au très vénérable Abbé H. Grégoire. This work of Grégoire's was soon translated into English as an inquiry concerning the intellectual and moral faculties and literatures of Negroes in 1810 by the Brooklyn printer Thomas Kirk. And so not only Wheatley's works become known throughout the Atlantic world, but the works of Equiano excerpted there and Ignatius Sancho. So Wheatley's writing is being used long after her death, is functioning in very particular ways. So the Abbé Grégoire in De la littérature des nègres kind of takes on Jefferson in this quote here by saying that Phillis Wheatley's poems actually do prove the merits of the quote-unquote African race. And the bottom quotation there is from Voltaire, who had earlier made the same argument to a friend. Long before either Bisset or the Abbé Grégoire's reprinting of her works in France, however, Wheatley had already been crowned the first poet laureate of the African Americas, when 38 of her 39 poems on various subjects, religious and moral, from 1773, were appended to an anonymous U.S. translation of Joseph Lavallee's 1789 novel about a runaway slave from Saint-Domingue, Le Nègre comme il y a peu de blanc. Lavallee's novel had first been translated and published in London by J. Trapp in 1790 as The Negro Equaled by Few Europeans. It would go on to be translated yet again and published anonymously in Philadelphia in 1808, where it appeared with the same title alongside almost the entire volume of Wheatley's 1773 book. So I mentioned there's 38 of her 39 poems. The poem that is missing is To the King's Most Excellent Majesty. So it's 1801 in Philadelphia. So I think that's why, right? We don't need an homage to the king anymore. Well, Wheatley's works were apparently so important to this new translator that the name of her collection now appeared on the title page. The Negro Equaled by Few Europeans, translated from the French, to which are added poems on various subjects, moral and entertaining. So you can see how titling is working here to signal a certain kind of politics. Just Chanlat using the Abbé Grégoire in his title, and the translator or publisher using Wheatley's poems in the title here. But you will notice, maybe, let me scroll down here, maybe you can see this, that the title is slightly different. So Wheatley's book was actually called Poems on Various Subjects, Religious and Moral, but the translator or publisher writes Poems on Various Subjects, Moral and Entertaining. So the word moral here ends up replacing religious. The translator or publisher of the US edition made certain other changes as well. Not only is there no preface like the earlier British translator left, but this person also omitted Lavallee's own preface, adding instead Wheatley's poems, as if to suggest that these poems alone were enough to contextualize this French abolitionist tale, which is a really long 18th century novel because it's the 18th century principally. And this is an adventure novel written by an author who had explicitly stated that his object in depicting a noble runaway slave from colonial Saint-Domingue was to, quote unquote, make the blacks loved. So this is her works, again, being made to kind of travel far beyond their original purpose. And in fact, a French scholar, Romy Sanchez, has recently written an article discussing how a biography of Phyllis Wheatley, B.B. Thatcher's 1832 biography, was found among the papers of a free man of color in Havana in 1835. So there was really just an amazing cultural valence that she had, and this free man of color was actually charged with sedition and inciting slave rebellion, and the indictment lists these documents that he had on his person as evidence, and B.B. Thatcher's biography of Phyllis Wheatley is one of the documents proving that he meant to sow slave rebellion in Havana. Well, it is by now well known that in what is considered to be by many the first African-American novel, Clotel or the President's Daughter, published in London in 1853, William Wells Brown, who claimed to have traveled to Haiti in the 1840s, borrowed a significant portion of his descriptions of life on antebellum U.S. plantations from the British abolitionist John R. Beard's The Life of Toussaint Louverture. What has not been acknowledged is that Brown borrowed again from Beard in his 1854 abolitionist speech turned pamphlet, Santo Domingo, Its Revolutions and Its Patriots, first delivered in London and then in Philadelphia. Brown also transposed significant portions of original passages from Clotel into the speech. So passages from the novel that are about the United States end up in the speech, which is about Haiti. This suggests to me that when he was thinking about the United States, he was often imagining Haiti and vice versa. Wells Brown continued to borrow from Beard's speech for over 4 decades, republishing these words sometimes in the context of Haitian history, but very often to narrate antebellum U.S. histories of slavery, such as in his works, The Black Man, His Antecedents, His Genius and His Achievements, and a later work, The Rising Sun, or The Antecedents and Advancement of the Colored Race. Then, of course, there is Frank J. Webb's attempt to portray Toussaint Louverture as a, quote, warrior, rather than a monkey-faced person with a handkerchief about his head in The Garys and Their Friends, the second novel after Brown's to be published in London by an African American from the United States. Webb's engagement with the visual culture of Haiti reveals that in the 19th century diasporic imagination, Haiti was much more than the stereotype that it would become in 20th century US references to the country. So there's a certain vindicationist element in many of these writings that is very similar to what we find in early 19th century Haitian writing as well. To a certain extent, then, Webb's work anticipates the kind of revisionist history offered over a century later by J. Michael Dash in Haiti and the United States. So we might think of what I have just traced here as a diasporic text network of transnational African-American writing. I'm influenced here by Kirsten Silva Gru's and Susan Gilman's writing on the hemispheric text network of American studies. In expanding the term to more specifically think about what a diasporic form of writing might look like, I'm really looking for a language with which to situate the way that Haiti was connected to this emergent African American literary culture. Connected not just through references or plot lines, though these are important elements as well, but also through the very languages and vocabularies utilized in the text to think about ending slavery, to think about ending colonialism. There is a grammar embedded in these writings that has a relationship not only to a time and space, that of the Haitian Revolution and 19th century Haiti, respectively, but to a third space of language. Here, not marked as a common dialect, but rather a shared vocabulary of revolution. The intricate linking up of African American with the Afro-Caribbean and French colonial history of Haiti lends credence to the notion that, as Maxwell Whiteman has observed, to the American Negro of the 19th century, no subject was more engrossing than the history and uprisings of Saint-Domingue. This also emphasizes the significance of a Haitian revolutionary lexicon that could be used to promote the idea of a global fraternity of people of African descent. In this quote-unquote fraternity, the space of Haiti itself becomes an African-American crossroads, both imaginatively and in fact. So I'm going to be focusing mostly on those imaginative journeys, but I do want to pause on the African-American painter Robert Douglas Jr. for a moment. So Douglas Jr. traveled to Haiti in 1837. He painted several still lifes. He witnessed some celebrations of Haitian independence, and he wrote home to William Lloyd Garrison in The Liberator to describe what he saw. He said that Haiti had a kind of military government that he didn't agree with, but he still found much reason to offer praise. He said, the artillery thundered in unison with the voices of a free people, celebrating the emancipation they themselves had achieved. But continuing to think about the way that Haiti was also a linguistic crossroads for Black solidarity brings us to the famous French novelist Alexandre Dumas. Like Séjour, Dumas had roots in Saint-Domingue. In Dumas' novel, Georges, which is his only novel that deals overtly with race and slavery, the Haitian Revolution provides the inspiration for a foiled slave revolt. But before giving you the textual example, a few biographical details might be helpful, because the Dumas family had deep ties to Saint-Domingue. Dumas' father, Thomas Alexandre Dumas, was considered to be the first quote-unquote Negro general and the highest-ranking person of color in any European army of the 19th century. Interestingly enough, Toussaint Louverture would succeed him later as the second highest-ranking person of color in a European army when he became a general as well. Despite having these genealogical ties to Saint-Domingue, and therefore independent Haiti, General Dumas' son, Alexandre Dumas, of course of the Three Musketeers, was in many ways notoriously circumspect about his racial identity, and more specifically about his genealogical connection to Haiti. The handful of times that Dumas evoked his African ancestry include an 1838 letter to the Martinican abolitionist Cyril Bisset, the editor of that Parisian periodical La Revue des Colonies I earlier mentioned. In this letter, Dumas expressed his anti-slavery sympathy for his frères de race and friends of color. Yet as far as we know, Dumas only once spoke explicitly of his personal, figured as fraternal connection to Haiti. On August 5th, 1838, Dumas addressed a letter to the Haitian government. In the letter, he said that he felt compelled to, quote, erect a statue to his father in France. But given that General Dumas was from Saint-Domingue, he wanted to be sure that he would not be preempting the Haitian government from doing the same. Dumas subsequently proposed a global fundraising effort on the part of, quote, only the people of color, no matter in what part of the world they inhabit. He said the people of color could collectively raise 40,000 francs, upon receipt of which one statue would be erected in Port-au-Prince and one in Paris. Dumas finished the letter by evoking a sense of glory about not only the Haitian Revolution, but about his father's, and therefore ostensibly a Haitian's, contribution to the making of the French nation-state. He wrote, "It seems to me in any case that it would be good for the Haitians to teach old Europe, which is so proud of its ancient history and its civilization, that they, the Haitians, only cease to be French after having provided their own contribution to the glory of France." Dumas was a really important figure, the novelist, in the mid-19th century United States. William Wells Brown wrote, for example, that he longed to meet Dumas, since in his estimation, no writer filled a more important place in the literature of his country, meaning France, than this son of a Negro general. Dumas was so extraordinarily popular in the antebellum US to the point that, according to Michel Fabre, in the black press, his name would appear as frequently as that of Pushkin or even Toussaint Louverture. While Dumas did evoke Haiti in a tongue-in-cheek way in The Count of Monte Cristo in 1844, it is in his prior novel, Georges, which takes place in colonial Ile-de-France or present-day Mauritius, that we can really see Dumas' adoption of a Haitian Atlantic grammar. A slave named Laiza seeks to encourage slave rebellion, when in making a speech to his fellow recruits, he formally invokes the idea of Haitian revolutionary solidarity. Once upon a time, he says, there was an island where all the slaves wanted to be free. Together they rose up and they made it happen. This island used to be called Saint-Domingue. At this time it is called Haiti. Let's do what they did, and we will be free like them. There is also a passage in the novel where Georges implores his father to become the head of the black militia. He tells him, "Father, there they are, the Negroes, and they are awaiting a leader." This sentence becomes as apocryphal to the impending insurrection as the Histoire des Deux Indes, a famous work of collaboration signed by the Abbé Raynal, becomes to Haitian revolutionary history. I'm going to come back to that in a moment, so I want you to remember that phrase, "There they are, the Negroes, and they're awaiting a leader." But thinking about the Haitian Revolution's travels beyond the United States, continuing to think about that, I want to go to Trinidad for a moment. In the first Trinidadian novel written by a writer of color, Maxwell Phillips' Emmanuel Apadoka, we see a structure of attitude and reference to Haiti, one that is used not to encourage a slave revolt, but rather to critique the economic underpinnings of US slavery. The eponymous hero tells us that he borrowed his buccaneers from a crowd of former Maroons and French aristocrats then living in independent Haiti, who were more than ready to seize an opportunity to join their once disparate interests together in order to, quote, avenge themselves on men. It is only in the preface of this novel that we are told that the abolition of slavery is the goal of the author. The first sentence of the preface reads, "This work has been written at a moment when the feelings of the author are roused up to a high pitch of excitement by a statement of the cruel manner in which the slaveholders of America deal with their slave children." The presence of references to Haitian revolutionary solidarity were usually obvious in the US-based African-American literary tradition. We can think of the speeches of Wells Brown, Douglass, Walker, James McCune Smith, Henry Highland Garnet, James Theodore Hawley. But in the works of these Black romantics, sometimes the references are more subtle and fleeting. They need to be teased out. But nowhere is this Haitian presence more repressed than in some of the earliest female writings from the African diaspora. The Connecticut-born Mariah W. Stewart was a free person of color living in the northern US. She was a friend of the fiery orator David Walker. Like Walker, who explicitly mentioned Haiti at several junctures in his 1830 appeal to the colored citizens of this world, Stewart also referenced independent Haiti in the course of her career as an orator and author. In her 1832 address delivered before the African-American Female Intelligence Society of Boston, later printed in the prominent abolitionist Garrison's The Liberator, Stewart spoke out against international non-recognition of Haiti. She said, "The Haitians, though they have not been acknowledged as a nation, yet their firmness of character and independence of spirit have been greatly admired and highly applauded." This language of revolutionary solidarity could often operate in much more amorphous ways in Stewart's work as well. Stewart appears to have referenced Haiti in a metaphorical way when she suggested that it were only a matter of time before a Black revolutionary descended upon the United States in order to lead the slaves to freedom. Stewart alluded to Walker's death in her address delivered at the African Masonic Hall in 1833 by saying, "Where is the man that has distinguished himself in these modern days by acting wholly in the defense of African rights and liberty? There was one. Although he sleeps, his memory lives." So she's eulogizing David Walker, who died a very mysterious death. Earlier, she had suggested that such a defender of African rights and liberty might actually turn out to be a woman. In Stewart's lecture delivered at the Franklin Hall, she rather provocatively stated, Methinks I heard a spiritual interrogation. Who shall go forward and take off the reproach that is cast upon the people of color? Shall it be a woman? And my heart made this reply, if it is thy will, be it even so, Lord Jesus. Stuart's questions have resonance with what has been referred to as the Black Spartacus passage in the aforementioned historic compilation, Histoire des Deux Indes. In what is the most widely referenced example of the Enlightenment literacy narrative, the idea that Toussaint Louverture read Enlightenment philosophy and that's what inspired him to slave rebellion, Raynal and his collaborators would appear to have foreshadowed a moment wherein a grand homme would liberate the slaves and lead them towards revenge, so more than just freedom and equality. The passage reads, "Your slaves do not have a need for your generosity, nor for your advice to break the sacrilegious yoke that oppresses them. Nature speaks louder than philosophy and vested interest. The Negroes only want a courageous leader to transport them to vengeance and to carnage. Where is he, this great man, whom nature owes to her vexed, oppressed, and tormented children? Where is he, this new Spartacus?" So the narrative is that Louverture would have read or heard this passage and imagined himself to be, and then have transformed himself into the Black Spartacus. Of course, Mariah W. Stewart is saying, why must this Black Spartacus necessarily be a man? Perhaps this will be a woman for the United States. Like Stewart, Sarah Fortin, the daughter of abolitionists Charlotte and James Fortin, also used a vocabulary related to the Haitian Revolution when she evoked Louverture's famous expression about the tree of liberty in her most well-known essay, The Abuse of Liberty, also published in The Liberator. Subsequent to being captured by the armed forces of Général Leclerc, Toussaint Louverture reportedly said, "In overthrowing me, you have only knocked down one trunk of the tree of the liberty of the blacks, but it will grow again from the roots, because they are deep and numerous." In Fortin's essay, after asking about slaves, is it because their skins are black that they are to be deprived of every tender tie that binds the heart of man to earth? Fortin makes the following prophecy of a god rather than a Louverture figure who acts as the Black Spartacus. "Can you think he," she wrote, "the great spirit who created all men free and equal, he who made the sun to shine on the black man as well as on the white, will always allow you to rest tranquil on your downy couches? No, he is just, and his anger will not always slumber. He will wipe the tear from Ethiopia's eye. He will shake the tree of liberty, and its blossoms shall spread all over the earth." So there's also a certain resonance here with Thomas Jefferson's notes on the state of Virginia, that I tremble for my country when I reflect that God is just. But noticeably, in Louverture's evocation of the tree of liberty, these are roots, and they sort of come up out of the ground and they uproot things in their path. But in Fortin's metaphor, these are blossoms that will be carried on the wind and spread over the earth from above. With the knowledge of Haiti that was in constant circulation in the 19th century Atlantic world, it is very likely that it was by way of the very words, if not the writings themselves, of the Haitian revolutionists like Louverture, Dessalines, and Christophe, that readers and writers like Sarah Fortin and Mariah Stewart became familiar with this vocabulary of the Haitian Revolution. This is especially true if we believe that, as Michael Drexler and Ed White have recently claimed, following its dissemination throughout the US in the fall of 1801, Toussaint's Constitution became the most widely read piece of literature authored by an African American and may have remained so until the publication of the narrative of the life of Frederick Douglass in 1845. It was not only the words of Louverture that were reprinted widely in the US and beyond, but also those of Jean-Jacques Dessalines, the founder of independent Haiti. In Beyond the Slave Narrative, Deborah Jensen reveals that Dessalines' famous "I Have Avenged America" manifesto from April of 1804, which redeployed the classical tree of liberty metaphor, was first published in English in the United States in June of 1804, prior to being published in France on August 7th, 1804. So this language of Venger l'Amérique has a very long and storied origin as well. In one sense, we could think of it as coming from Voltaire's 1736 Alzire, which, according to Laurent Dubois, who's in the audience, who says that the play was performed in French Saint-Domingue in the years leading up to the Haitian Revolution, so its language may very well have been familiar to the Haitian revolutionists who subsequently wrote the Declaration of Independence, so including Dessalines, Bois-Tonnerre, and Chanlat. The proclamation was subsequently reprinted and circulated throughout the American hemisphere along with Dessalines' November 29, 1803 Declaration of Independence, the latter of which first appeared in Poulson's Daily Advertiser on January 5, 1804, and that's the work that contained the memorable lines, Liberté ou la mort. Liberty or death, a phrase used in the American, French, and Haitian revolutions, would go on to be repeated and repeatedly repurposed in numerous texts produced by writers of color from the American hemisphere, including Maria Stewart. But it memorably appears as an implied threat to slaveholders rather than as purely a threat of suicide or willingness to die in combat in a militant poem lamented by the character Placido in Martin Delany's Blake. Henry Blake's attempt to produce a transnational ethnography of comparative slavery in the Americas is a fitting place to contemplate the long history of the Haitian Revolution in the Atlantic world. Delany's Blake discovers that the dissimilarities to be found on U.S. plantations could be overcome by the universal concept of slave organization into rebellion. He imagines that enslavers, like the people whom they enslaved, were experiencing the same obstacles and emotions across the Atlantic world. After becoming aware of the unrest among the enslaved population and the free people of color of Cuba, Blake tells us, "Few people in the world lead such a life as the white inhabitants of Cuba and those of the Southern Confederacy of America, a dreamy existence of the most fearful apprehensions of dread, horror, and dismay. Suspicion and distrust, jealousy and envy continuously pervade the community. A sleeping wake or waking sleep, a living death or tormented life is that of the Cuban and American slaveholder. If all of these quote-unquote slaveholders could be imagined to be living largely the same life of miserable apprehension of slave vengeance, regardless of national affiliation or geography, then slave revolt and rebellion could be described or dreamed up with largely the same vocabulary too. And this vocabulary was Haitian. Witness Delany's own evocation of the Black Spartacus in a text that makes multiple references to the Haitian Revolution. They were ripe for a general uprising, but God only knew where they would find a leader. By exploring both the evident and obscured Haitian revolutionary vocabularies to be found in this particular network of transnational African American writing, I propose that the often occluded, repressed, or ignored presence of Haiti has something to tell us about the geography of diasporic literary cultures, the way that they moved, the way that they are not contained by spaces, but perhaps freed by them. These references to Haiti form an integral part of a broader transnational 19th century American literary culture that reveals itself to have been shaped in many ways by not only what Anna Brickhouse has called Franco-Africanist shadows, but by a Haitian Atlantic conception of the world, one that was catalyzed in a vocabulary culled from the Haitian Revolution, in fact, or due to the kind of intertextual universalism that thinking about emancipation from slavery and independence from colonialism really engenders. So when we think about Venger l'Amérique in 3 texts leading up to its iteration in the Declaration of Independence, it's not that hard to imagine enslaved people wanting to get revenge against their masters. In suggesting that Haiti was likely only one of the most prevalent, but certainly not the only sign of Black solidarity in the 19th century Atlantic world, I think we need to contemplate a transnational African American studies that begins much earlier than the Harlem Renaissance, one that does not have a clearly defined beginning or an end along the order of a linear teleology of history, one that is much less reliant on solidarities of race and identity and relies more on solidarities of context and content. Constructing a transnational African American literary geography of this sort entails a transformation of received historical, national, and temporal literary boundaries. Perhaps what we must think about instead of assorted literary traditions are myriad kinds of literary geographies which defy the conventions of canonization and periodization. Such a move toward understanding Afro-diasporic writing as a part of various kinds of international geographies of literature, rather than as parts of specific national literary traditions, frees us also to describe as diasporic the important works by Lavallée, Beard, Raynal, Voltaire, Mercier, and Grégoire that I've described as vital to the Haitian Atlantic intertextualities being traced here. So just to give one final example of what I mean, this same Haitian Atlantic grammar of solidarity, rather than purely a fear about the Haitian Revolution that we can find in texts not ordinarily defined as African American, appears in Harriet Beecher Stowe's 1856 Dread. So Martin Delany had complained to Frederick Douglass about Stowe's stereotypical representation of Blacks as too capitulatory in her earlier work, Uncle Tom's Cabin. And this is a work in which sort of the more traditional early American narrative of fear about the Haitian Revolution is evoked. In the work, a character named Augustine St. Clair from New Orleans comments, "If ever the San Domingo hour comes, Anglo-Saxon blood will lead on the day. Sons of white fathers, with all our haughty feelings burning in their veins, will not always be bought and sold and traded. They will rise and raise with them their mother's race." But in her 1856 Dread, solidarity in reference to the Haitian Revolution is what is on display. After the death of the character Dread, Stowe laments before eulogizing Dread with William Wordsworth's famous 1803 poem, To Toussaint Louverture. His name might have been, with that of Toussaint, celebrated in mournful sonnet by the deepest thinking poet of the age. Here is the portion of the Wordsworth poem, it's highlighted in white there, as quoted by Stowe in the form of an elegy for Dread. "Thou hast left behind powers that will work for thee, air, earth, and skies. There's not a breathing of the common wind that will forget thee. Thou hast great allies. Thy friends are exaltations, agonies, and love, and man's unconquerable mind." What else is this, if not creative collaboration and the language of diasporic solidarity, to say that there are powers working together in the common wind, allies for the freedom and equality for which Dread dies in Stowe's novel and for which Louverture died in his real life? In the end, what I'm less ardently proposing than I'm merely gesturing towards here is an understanding of all of American literature as diasporic in the vein described by Robin Kelly, who, speaking of historiography, has offered that a diasporic history of the United States could be determined not by geopolitics, but by people and their movements, physical and mental, real and imagined. A diasporic understanding of African American writing, too, could be linked not solely by common places of meaning and identity, but also by common places of meaning and affiliation. That is to say, it could be conceived of less in the national terms of Anderson via Benjamin's homogeneous empty time, and more using the boundless pregnancy of diaspora time, defined by Yogita Goyal as a time that is characterized by rupture, but also by various kinds of imagined or projected simultaneities. Thank you.
Take some questions. Thank you. That was really a very eye-opening account of the Haitian Revolution's reach and its place in the Atlantic world. Marlene has agreed to take questions if you raise your hand. Do you want to call on people or should I? So Marlene will call on you, but please wait until Brooke Andrade in the red dress brings you the microphone. We're recording this event, and so it's important that you be mic'd. So please be patient once you've been selected to comment.
Elena, thank you for such a fantastic talk. I learned so much. I was wondering, could you talk a little bit about how you see the three circuits that you started with intersecting, or do you see them kind of running on separate tracks?
Yeah, so I do see them intersecting, but I think they could sort of do both, run on separate tracks and intersect. Particularly so if I think about the slide that I have, Haiti as African American crossroads, which involves people who went to Haiti, lived there, or spent a lot of time there and then reported back home. But there's also a way in which in the novels, people are kind of doing that exact same thing. And the circulation of text sort of forces people like Phyllis Wheatley, who of course could never travel to Haiti because she died before the Haitian Revolution even began, sort of allows her to kind of metaphorically or symbolically go there, at least through the work. So I do see them intersecting, but I also think there's a way in which you could completely understand this as them running on separate tracks as well.
Thank you for a very elegant talk. I also really appreciated it. Last week I had a cold, and so I decided that just the ticket would be 1,200-page novel. And as it happens, I therefore reread The Count of Monte Cristo. And I was, of course, particularly interested in what you had to say about Dumas. And I thank you for it in particular because it helped me better understand one of the most disconcerting elements of a disconcerting novel. There's a slave in The Count of Monte Cristo. The Count arrives in Paris with a gorgeous young woman in tow, and he announces to all and sundry, they ask who she is, he says, well, she's my slave. And this really disconcerts people. This is, Paris in the 1830s, and they didn't have slavery. But this doesn't stop them. Her story is explained a little bit, but there are still odd elements about it. And what you had to say about Georges and about Dumas' history and his approach really has helped me to understand that better. So I thank you. I'm going to go back now and reread, not the whole novel, but the passages about Haiti.
Thank you. I thank you too. I don't really know very much about Haiti, other than one tragedy after another. And yet, DR seems to be in much better shape than Haiti, and I've always been puzzled by that. What accounts for the differences between them? Do you know that? I mean, is that?
What accounts for the differences between Haiti and the Dominican Republic?
Yeah, I mean, there's.
Where do I begin? Yes, I mean, there's a different history of colonialism. Of course, there's a disastrous indemnity paid to France, Trujillo, the American occupation, Duvalier. Yeah, I could go on and on, but I mean, beyond that, I think that the world powers really punished Haiti after the Haitian Revolution, and I think when you sort of look at the diplomatic history from the earliest days of independence through the 19th century into the 20th century, you can really see the United States, England, and France, to a large extent, putting a stranglehold on Haitian economics and freezing Haiti out politically and economically. So I would say that is probably the biggest thing that accounts for the quote-unquote differences, although they're, as René Philoctet said, these are one people, les peuples de la terre mêlée. They're just one people artificially separated by a border that is just physical, right? But it's actually, they're one people, so.
Thank you for your talk again. I was actually going to ask you about the Dominican Republic as well, but in terms of your project and whether you found text going there, considering the fact that Haiti controls the whole island, or if you see people going to the eastern side of the island.
So that's interesting. I would say in some of the earlier novels, there are certainly Baron Roger's Kéléodore, people, there's not the kind of separation that we typically think of. People are on the eastern side of the island as well. But in these particular writings that I discussed here today, that doesn't really happen, principally because Haiti is operating in this kind of really symbolic way. And you'll have noticed that most of the texts came from the 1850s, sort of the period we call the American Renaissance. And so African-American writing of this time period is having its own kind of renaissance, and Haiti's appearing at the center of that. So that could be one reason why. But certainly in the later period, there are texts in which people are traveling and imagining travel to the eastern side of the island. And certainly in Haitian authored texts, and Haitian authors like René Philoctet, but even earlier authors, arguing that quote-unquote Dominicans and Haitians are not two separate people. They are actually one people. And so sort of trying to explain how it came to pass that they are two separate peoples nationally.
So I just wanted to touch on, you mentioned this concept that space does not contain these ideas, but kind of liberates it, right? Mm-hmm. And I found that particularly interesting. And it was something that I attempted to do with my thesis. But I guess my question is, how do you do that in a way that doesn't dilute, I guess, the significance of these main points of it? If we broaden the scope to so far, how do you make those connections between 19th century and 20th century? Or does that make sense?
So how Can you repeat the last part?
In terms of making, I guess, these connections over time, you used the phrase, I think, that all Black writing is diasporic. So how do we connect the 19th century literature of, Phyllis Wheatley writing on Haiti to Black activists in World War II writing about Ethiopia, and not dilute, I guess, the message, because you're talking about this large space and time?
I think that this is one of the benefits of textual studies, which is that we can sort of ask ourselves why this common language is why this is the vocabulary that we have to describe certain forms of activism. So that's really what I'm interested in when I talk about the vocabularies being repeated, either because people were reading each other, or because the texts were traveling in certain ways, or because there's a certain kind of universalism to thinking about what it means to strive for freedom and equality, and to actually go about making that happen. So I think that's one of the things that I'm trying to focus on, is the way that languages, even if people are writing in different actual dialects, could still be similar, could be speaking to one another, and could have something in common. And I think that's why you find Baron de Vaté, for example, sounding a lot like Aimé Césaire, or rather Aimé Césaire sounding a lot like Baron de Vaté, or Frantz Fanon, or W.E.B. Du Bois, because not only are they reading each other's works, but there's also a common language there, which is diasporic solidarity, and which is also activism, actual activism, going out and actually trying to affect the change that they're writing about. So that's, I guess, one way to answer it.
Well, thank you, Marlene.
Oh.
Is there one more? I want to invite everybody to the Berkman Lounge, where we'll have a reception. We have food and wine, so you can continue the conversation there. Thank you.